Tim, this represents several decades of research and work on your part. Why did you want to call this series God Save the King?
Michael, it's actually a play on words.
Okay.
Now, part of it is the fact that for centuries, if not millennia, the way you extol the king of a country is you say, "Long live the king," or "Long may he reign," or "God save the king." So in our story, one of the main characters is Herod the Great, who had a habit of killing any challenger to his throne. So to me, I'm pretty sure he had a lot of yes men surrounding him who were looking out for their own neck, who were saying, "God save the king."
Whether they meant it or not.
Yeah, whether they meant it or not. But in reality, we're flipping it over because we know that Jesus of Nazareth is going to present a real threat to Herod, and that Herod is going to try to kill him. So on one hand, we're playing it tongue in cheek and saying, Herod, oh, God save the king. But what we really mean is Jesus of Nazareth, God save the king.
Tim, one of the things that you've said to me over and over is that, and one of the things we're talking about, is that in the traditional story, we're missing the history, the historical aspect of how this happened. So let's revisit that, and I'm guessing the best place to start would be under the United Kingdom, or during the United Kingdom, under the reign of David and Solomon.
I think that's a really good place to start. It seems like a long way back, and it is. It's about 1,000 years, but there's some important components that go that far back. So the first three kings of Israel were Saul, David, and Solomon. Now we know from the Bible that each of these men had some very human weaknesses, but all three of them were also very strong kings that kept the kingdom united. So by the end of Solomon's reign, Israel had defeated its enemies, they'd built the temple, they had developed a flourishing economy, and they really had peace and prosperity throughout their kingdom. They frankly had reached the pinnacle of their power.
What's wrong with that?
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. It's great. The problem is that oftentimes when you reach the peak like that, there's only one way to go, which unfortunately is down.
As many empires do. So I guess that leads us to the divided kingdom. A house divided against itself cannot stand.
Absolutely, right out of the Bible. So when Solomon died, his son Rehoboam took over. But he faced a challenger, a young leader named Jeroboam. Now Rehoboam, he had some problems. Number one, he was young and inexperienced.
But he's got the bloodline.
Yeah, he's got the bloodline. He's a legitimate heir, but he's young and inexperienced. He's arrogant, but probably his worst problem was he was prone to following bad advice.
Probably in the form of flattery first.
Well, it could be, but part of what happened is he did not retain his father's advisors. Now think about that for a moment. Solomon is known as being one of the wisest men that ever lived, and Solomon had court advisors. So here's his son. He rejects his father's own advisors, and he makes his own advisors, which is all young guys his age, and that's who he listens to, and they give him some pretty bad advice. They pretty much told him, look, if the people don't do what you want, you squish them, and just force them to do what it is you want. So he's opposed by this young leader named Jeroboam. Now, Jeroboam was charismatic, intelligent, and highly qualified, so that presented a real problem. Rehoboam, if he'd had a brain, if he'd done things correctly, Jeroboam probably would have fallen in line and simply been a leader under Rehoboam. But the problem was that Rehoboam acted very rashly, very harshly against the people. So Jeroboam split off, and 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel followed him, and they set up the northern kingdom in what became known as the Kingdom of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
2 tribes remained loyal to Rehoboam in the south, and they became known as the Southern Kingdom, or the Kingdom of Judah.
With Israel now divided in two, what are the repercussions of that, both politically and on the people?
Well, it's real simple. It's no longer a united kingdom. They're no longer united geographically. they're no longer united culturally or religiously, because we have to remember, because it's part of our story, that the Hebrew nation is a pilgrimage culture. They have festivals every year where every able-bodied male is required to travel and attend that festival, right? So if you have a divided kingdom, what do the citizens in the northern kingdom do if they have to travel to the southern kingdom to celebrate?
So they're mixing amongst the people that their leader might not want them to mix with?
Well, yeah, so what happens is that Jeroboam sets up an alternative form of worship in the northern kingdom. So what this means is they're no longer united geographically, they're no longer united culturally or religiously, because you've got this alternative form of worship in the northern kingdom. It also means that they're no longer united ethnically, because as we're going to see as we move forward, both kingdoms are now going to start to intermarry with other nationalities. So no longer united geographically, no longer united culturally, religiously, and to an increasing degree, ethnically.
All right, so I understand, but why, here again, we always come back to this question. I don't know why, but why is this important? Everything that you're saying makes sense, and it is the way that civilizations often go.
Sure, but if we jump forward, remember our primary theme here is that we're looking at the common misconceptions of the traditional nativity story. And in the traditional nativity story, we often assume that the nation of Israel at that time is this homogeneous Hebrew state, and it's not. It hasn't been for a long time. And the critical component of the divided kingdom, having followed the united kingdom, is that there is now this idea in the back of every Hebrew's mind of when will the kingdom be restored.
Now that the empire is divided, that also makes them more vulnerable.
Absolutely.
Explain that.
Okay.
What happens?
Well, as we move forward in history to set the background for the birth of Jesus Christ, the next big thing that happens is the captivity of the northern kingdom by the Assyrians. The Assyrians were one of the dominant empires of the ancient Middle East. They dominated Upper Mesopotamia from the 14th century to the 7th century. The Assyrians do two things that are relevant to our story. Number one, they invade southern Mesopotamia, a region known as Chaldea. And the reason this is important is because it's going to be the Chaldean dynasty of the Babylonian Empire that eventually is going to conquer the Assyrians. But the second thing that's important to our story is that the Assyrians invade only the northern kingdom, not the southern kingdom, just the northern kingdom of Israel, and this is a period of time known as the Assyrian captivity. And what happens is that the Assyrians export large numbers of Jews to other parts of their empire, and then in addition, they import large numbers of foreigners to live in the northern kingdom.
So they are almost doing a form of ethnic cleansing for control to dilute the culture.
Absolutely, that's exactly what they're doing. This way, they lose some of their identity, and it makes it harder for them to rebel. And part of what we know from the Bible is that this is the source of the stigma that is attached to what are known as Samaritans, because Samaria is the capital of the northern kingdom. And now, because of these foreigners coming in and because of the intermarriage, now Samaritans are known from this point forward in the Bible as a kind of half-breed and not a true Jew.
And this also marks the beginning of the diaspora.
Absolutely, that's exactly what it is.
All right, so this, I guess, brings us up to the Babylonians.
Absolutely. So taking up with what we mentioned before, the Chaldeans start to have influence in middle Mesopotamia and then eventually northern Mesopotamia. They become more of a power themselves, and they start to push back against the Assyrian Empire. So there is a coalition of Babylonians and Medes and Cimmerians and Scythians, and they actually defeat the Assyrians. It's one of the most famous military battles of the ancient world. It's known as the Battle of Carchemish, and an Assyrian ally was actually Egypt. So the Egyptian forces had come north through Israel, and when they were on their way to Upper Mesopotamia, when a young Babylonian general named Nebuchadnezzar comes in, and he defeats Pharaoh Necho at the Battle of Carchemish. It's this major battle, but now Babylon, the Babylonian Empire, they become the new superpower in the Middle East.
And the repercussion of that upon the Jewish people is?
Well, they have a different foreign policy than the Assyrians. So number one, they do inherit the Assyrian captives because they've taken over all that territory, but they have a slightly different foreign policy in that what they do is they export the best and the brightest from the areas they've captured. They bring them to the courts of Babylon, and they train them to work in their courts, because after all, an educated man is an educated man. You better take advantage of that.
Certainly, that makes absolute sense. So they are taking the brightest and the best, elevating them in influence in their courts. That's good for the Jewish people.
Absolutely. And we all know the story. If you've attended Sunday school, we know the names of 4 prominent Hebrew captives, that this is what happened to them. Now, their Hebrew names are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, but of course we know them more by their Babylonian names, which is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and of course, Daniel. And we know the story that they're being trained to be wise men. That's their job description. They're smart kids. The Babylonians are training them, but then Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and no one can interpret it. So since they're in that category, they're likely to get in trouble too. They pray to God. God gives them the interpretation of the dream. Daniel goes before the king. He tells him the dream and the interpretation, and then Nebuchadnezzar elevates Daniel to be the chief of the wise men of Babylon.
That's a good position to be in.
Yes, it is.
So these people are essentially training to be magi, and he is now the leader of the magi.
Yes, he is. Nebuchadnezzar gives him the title. It's in Aramaic. It's Rab-Mag, and Rab means head, and Mag is an abbreviation of magi. Daniel is the chief of the magi, and as a result, he has a job, which is to give a daily intelligence briefing to the king. He's the one that's going to look at all the important documentation. He's going to gather intelligence from out the realm, and he's going to tell the king, this is what you need to do.
That is a valuable role for Daniel, and I would think benevolent to the Jewish people. But continue on. At the end of the Babylonian captivity, we have another chapter, which is the Medo-Persians. Explain to me who they were and what they represented.
Absolutely. So during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, this is the famous handwriting on the wall incident in Daniel chapter 5. What they don't realize during that big party, that big celebration, is that a coalition of Medes and Persians have dammed the Euphrates River, and they are literally coming in under the walls of the city of Babylon, and the city of Babylon is about to fall to the Persians. So now, what this means for our story is that the Persian Empire is now the superpower in the area, and the Jews fall under Persian domination. So what this means is now all of the captives that were inherited from the Assyrians, and then the captives have inherited from the Babylonians, now they're under Persian control, but the Persians, they have a different foreign policy as well.
Which is?
They let them go home. They made the decision that it was reasonable for the Jews to return to their homeland, to rebuild their temple, and basically their foreign policy was, look, as long as you don't rebel and you pay your tribute, we'll pretty much leave you alone. The interesting component is that when they make this offer to the Jews and they give them the opportunity to return home, the majority of the Hebrew captives in Babylon chose to remain there.
Tim, so now we have Alexander the Great, one of the biggest figures in history, and the Greeks. Tell me about that.
Of course. So the Persian Empire was very expansionist, and they made several incursions into Greek territory that really upset the Greeks. They felt it was, even back in that day and age where this kind of thing was common, it was really uncalled for. So they really despised the Persians. So Alexander the Great's father, he spent his entire career intending to invade Persia and pay him back. But then he gets assassinated, so it falls upon his son, Alexander the Great, to get this revenge. And that's exactly what he does. He invades the Persian Empire, and in a very short period of time, he conquers the known world, so to speak. And he had this enormous empire that spanned all the way from Greece in the Mediterranean all the way to the Indus River in India. Huge, huge landmass. But history tells us that Alexander died quite young, so the next thing that happened is that his empire was divided up amongst his strongest generals. And this affects our story in two ways. Two of those generals wind up with territory that borders Judea. One is the Greek general Ptolemy. He was already the governor of Egypt when Alexander died, so he just declared Egypt to be his, and that was pretty simple for him. There were some wars that had to settle some of the other areas, but the other big one that plays a role in our story is the Greek general Seleucus. He inherits Mesopotamia and Babylon and all of the eastern provinces. How this affects our story is that Judea is right in the middle. And these two superpowers, they fight 5 wars over the next couple hundred years, with Judea right smack in the middle.
A recurring theme of this area being in a geographically strategic place.
Exactly, and that's exactly what happens. It's a strategic area. They fight these wars, but the Seleucid Empire is huge. The portion that Seleucus inherits, it includes a small portion of Asia Minor, all of Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and parts of India. It's enormous. And he simply cannot maintain control. It's too big. Part of what Alexander's dream was is he wanted to see a unified world empire that was Greek. It would have one language, it would have one culture, it would have one society, it would have one religion, and therefore you'd have this beautiful, wonderful, kind of utopian kind of thing going on. But he never really quite achieved that, certainly not Alexander didn't. But that influence lived on, that his generals really tried to push that influence on the areas that they controlled. But Seleucus's empire was so huge, and because it required an influx of native Greeks from Greece to move there, to be the ruling class, and to keep this going, it just became impossible for them to do it. So it didn't take too long before the Seleucid Empire began to weaken and then frankly disintegrate.
They simply could not maintain power of that area.
No, they just couldn't do it. So one of the first things that happened that's very important to our story is this kind of unknown province, unknown to most history-minded people, is this little unknown province at the southeast corner of the Caspian Sea called Parthia breaks away. So the Parthians, they were one of the first to break away. Not the first, but one of the first to break away from Greek rule and gain their independence. And what's going to happen is over the next 200 years, they are going to steadily increase the size of their empire, moving from east to west. They are the big unknown portion of this story, what's going to become known as the Parthian Empire.
And they will eventually butt heads with Rome, I guess.
That's right, that's going to come up. And then the second thing that's important to our story, you have to jump about 100 years further into the future, so about the middle of the 2nd century BC, the Seleucid power has weakened so much that even this teeny little kingdom of Judea can gain independence, because the Greeks, unlike the Persians before them, they treated the Greeks really poorly, really harshly. they frankly made being a Jew illegal. It was really horrible what they did. And the Jews just had a belly full of it. They just couldn't take it anymore.
It fuels uprising.
Exactly, and that's exactly what happened. They demanded that the Jews engage, frankly, in idolatry. That's really just what it boiled down to. And it instigated a revolt that we know from history as the Maccabean revolt under Judah Maccabee, which means the hammer. And then that ruling class became known as the Hasmoneans. So this is another critical component of our story, is that from the middle of the 2nd century BC until the middle of the 1st century BC, when they would eventually yield to the Romans, Judea was once again an independent kingdom. So this is another critical component of our story, is that from the middle of the 2nd century BC until the middle of the 1st century BC, when eventually they will get taken over by Rome, we have an independent Jewish kingdom. So this, of course, is bringing that thought idea that was in the back of their minds to the front of their minds, which is this the restoration? Are we going to return to the glory days of David and Solomon?
Fantastic.